Good evening, everybody, and you're all very welcome to tonight's Trasna Tira lecture. As we were saying there earlier, it's a history lecture, but this is a very, very topical one and very relevant to where we are currently. I'm delighted to be joined by Ida Milne this evening. Ida is originally from Ferns, County Wexford, currently living in County Kildare, experiencing broadband challenges like all the rest of us here in the country. Ida worked in the newspaper industry as a travel journalist before returning to education in the year 2000. She was awarded the prestigious Irish Research Council Marie Curie Actions Elevate Fellowship in 2014 to 2018 for a project exploring the impact of infectious diseases of childhood on society over the course of the 20th century. She's currently a lecturer of St. Patrick's Carlow College. She's vice chair of the Oral History Network of Ireland, a committee member of History of Science, Technology and Medicine in Ireland Network. She's a member of the Royal Irish Academy Historical Sciences Committee and represents the Academy on two international bodies for the history of science. She's co-chair of the European Social Science Conference Health and Environmental Standard. In 2018, she authored a book called Stacking the Coffins, Influenza, War and Revolution in Ireland, 1918 to 1919. And I'm thrilled to be able to welcome her here this evening to tell us about that period in our Irish history. So over to you, Ida, and I'll just share my screen here now.
Thank you very much for that introduction, and thank you very much for having me on as well. And the first slide that you're going to see once Liam shares the screen now is it's actually an image of the 1918-1919 virus taken from the time. Quite different sort of images to the images we see today. Perhaps next slide now, please, Liam. Thank you. So the 1918 flu and the 2020 COVID-19 crises, is it really useful to compare? Just to talk about this quickly in the beginning, when the Wuhan crisis, the current crisis began to emerge from Wuhan, I was really watching, fascinated, because I was sitting back looking at through the newspapers, through television. I've been collecting newspapers avidly in hard copies ever since it started arriving, because there were so many echoes straight away. The puzzle, for one thing, how it overwhelmed medicine, contemporary medical thinking, how it was, it's a different illness, a different disease, but it's similar because it's essentially like a kind of influenza, respiratory, in the symptoms that it produces. We were watching anxiously from afar, just as they were here in Ireland in 1918, 1919. As they saw at first it coming, wondering what was happening, when would it get here, how badly would it affect us, all those puzzles that we had as well. It's very similar in this medical puzzle in the way it had the potential to overwhelm health systems, and very much did in 1918, and in the large numbers of potential ill and of possible dead. And that's awful. One of the great things about now is that we were able, through media, to be able to tell people to stay at home, to explain to them the significance and the importance of that. And that so far has greatly reduced the number of dead, and it possibly could have had a similar kind of death scale without that. It's not over yet, so we don't know, and we hope it won't compare in any way to the 50 million dead of 1918, 1919. The work of the 1918-19 influenza pandemic researchers, myself and Patricia Marsh, who also continues to work on the flu in Ireland, we work with a loose group of other researchers around the world. for the last several years, as long as we've been researching it. Our work has really been put to many public interest uses in the last few months. And before this, our international network, which includes historians, historical demographers, geographers, health writers, we'd all been trying to work to increase awareness that a potential risk like this could happen again. And scientists really made us aware that they expected that it wasn't a question of whether it could happen, but how and how soon it could happen. And we had been trying to work to increase this kind of knowledge amongst the public and with medical and government interests. So in a way, the centenary focus 2 years ago provided what turned out to be an incredibly timely and, of course, incredibly sad way to draw attention to what was about to happen, that we didn't know was going to happen then, but we knew it would happen sometime. Next slide, please. Earlier today, Professor Cormac O'Grada was giving a talk to the Royal Irish Academy on a webinar on the economics of the pandemic. And he had one slide, this one here that you see, where he compared the COVID statistics, death statistics up to the 8th of July and to the total death statistics for 1918, 1919. And at the top statistic there, you can see that by the 8th of July, Ireland had 1,742 dead, whereas the total overall dead for 1918-19 was 23,000, including the excess pneumonia deaths. We think that we were so successful because we were able to, Ireland locked down so successfully compared to other countries like the US, the UK, Spain, Italy, and Sweden and Belgium as well. You can see there that their levels of death are much higher than ours are to date. So that's just some of Cormac's statistics, just to show you what might have been had we remained open and had the government not moved so quickly to lock down. Next slide, please. So it emerges in really here towards the end of May 1918. It's described, nobody knows what it is when it comes first. It's described as a mysterious malady or similar terms in the newspapers of the time. The British War Office had been very carefully monitoring for unusual disease events in civilian populations because such unusual disease events often came back from the war with the soldiers, diseases like typhus and smallpox. It was very traditional for them to come back. And everybody expected, and journalists were constantly writing about this in the newspapers, that great diseases always follow great wars. So when this disease, a mystery disease that turned some of the dead black, this had kind of echoes of pneumonic plague. It was very scary stuff. It showed up, first of all, in the kind of northeast quadrant of Ireland in the summer of 1918. And it was really quite frightening. It comes in summer, so it's not seen to be an influenza because it's out of season. And then I suppose people were a little bit primed for it to be some kind of a different disease. They thought it might, as I say, be something like pneumonic plague. The coverage was very like what we saw emerging from Wuhan. There were all this talk of the fear of the unknown. What was it? You know, what had caused it? And all these different versions or speculations on what it might be. So it takes people really a while to agree that it's a type of influenza. And it's one which we now know as the largest killing influenza pandemic on record since the 1500s. So right from the beginning, the disease caused puzzle and really, very like today, growing fear of what's seen as being uncontrollable. So you see governments quite quickly, even then, trying to talk in the newspapers as though they have control of it. They're trying to show that. And we saw that here too. I think issues like that idea in Wuhan of the government saying they were going to build a hospital in 5 days to try and show they had the situation under control. So doctors here were, and governments here were talking similarly, saying, oh, it's not that scary, we'll have it under control, we're well able to manage it. Next slide, please. It paralyzed contemporary society. It disrupted trade globally. All the newspapers talk about things like trade in the stock markets going quiet, about, say, the De Beers mines in South Africa not being able to mine, about people not being able to save crops, and issues like that. So that's a very similar picture to what we have today. And if I'd been talking to you about this kind of way it paralyzed really trade and kept people at home in their houses all over the world in 1918, 2 years ago, you would have been quite surprised about it. Whereas now it's not much of a surprise to us. It filled people with fear. There was no cure. Contemporary medical knowledge was puzzled by it. They had been very confident in the new knowledge about bacteria, and therefore their confidence that medicine had this means to combat infectious disease was punctured. And as it kept re-emerging in 3 or 4 waves, they had no confidence that it could go away. A neighbour of mine here in Straffan in County Kildare, Tommy Christian, who was 5 when he caught it, he told me when he was 97, that it kept coming back. So they stopped talking about it because they were afraid it would come back again, because it had come back repeatedly. Next slide, please. It spread really, really rapidly around the world, given that there was no air traffic. Of course, this spread is partly facilitated by movements of ships for the war, and particularly since America has entered the war in 1917, of them trying to rush soldiers across the Atlantic and to enter into the war arena. So every location in the world really caught it. Most countries had 3 waves, and we had 3 waves here. Some had 4 waves. For example, Sweden up in the north had a 4th wave in 1920. Most of South America's experience of it was in 1920. A thing that I find really interesting about it is that it has both common characteristics and then unique local features wherever it occurred. So these unique local features could often cause either a rise or a decline in death. Something like power shortages or water cuts, and that happened in Naas in County Kildare. They had both during the flu and in 1918-19, and that meant the gas company actually, most of the staff went down sick with the flu, so there was very little power to the town, and they also had water shortage issues. So that meant that they had a higher than normal incidence of the flu in Ireland. There were a particular black spot for it. Other issues, obviously tenement housing, and particularly the tenements of Dublin in Ireland, the notorious Dublin tenements, overcrowded housing, places where there was bad sewage, the conditions of poverty, and environmental issues like fog would also make it much worse. And you can imagine if you're living in a tenement house and there are maybe slates missing off the wall, cracks off the roof, cracks in the walls, and missing window panes, that you're already suffering from flu. This would make the smog coming in would make your experience of the disease much, much worse. Next slide, please. Where it originated is a much debated topic, and curiously the Americans have claimed it for themselves and the British tend to claim it for themselves as well. So the origin theories are either that it started in the US in Camp Funston, and that a cook, Albert Gitchell, was patient 0 when he caught it on the 11th of March 1918. The other argument is that it started between Aldershot and the clearinghouses on the English Channel side of France and Belgium, and that these conditions would have provided the ideal cauldron to cook up a flu, where the soldiers and what was then the live animal food to feed the army, geese and ducks and hens and pigs, which also can all be vectors of influenza, were kept in close quarters together. The Camp Funston theory is a very nice media-friendly story, but it's much debated. And our international flu group thinks that perhaps there was an earlier start and that a similar flu was circulating before then in several different countries, but might have been misidentified as something like purulent bronchitis or pyrexia of unknown origin. It was definitely spread by war conditions on troop transports and in those overcrowded camps. But where it originated is something that we continue to debate, and we'll probably never really know the real answer. Next slide, please. Contemporary medical doctors in 1918 came after some discussion to agree that it was influenza, and at the time they viewed influenza as being caused by a bacterium, likely Pfeiffer's bacillus, which they thought had caused the previous pandemic, the Russian pandemic in the 1890s. Pfeiffer's bacillus we now know as Haemophilus influenza bacterium, and or HIV. So doctors then had really great confidence in bacteriology. They understood that it was a brilliant tool to combat infectious disease, and the steady fall in numbers dying from infectious diseases in the early 1900s seemed to confirm their trust in bacteria, that it was a wonder for modern medicine. But when the flu seemed to defy normal bacteriological management methods, some doctors began to doubt it. And you can see this in the Irish literature. They'll say, perhaps this might be a virus. And others then went back to the old idea of disease being caused by miasmas, by damp, noxious airs. And this view was often expressed in relation to the war, where people would talk about this must be emanating from the dead bodies of the battlefields. So this view, the miasmatic view, continued for quite a long time. It wasn't confirmed that flu was a virus until the 1930s. Next slide, please. This is an image of one of the more scary features of the flu, where the body would really turn a kind of mauvish purple colour. It was called heliotrope cyanosis. It was regarded as an almost certain sign that death was near. And Dr. D. W. McNamara, who has given us one of the best Irish medical accounts of it, he was working as a junior doctor in the Mater in Dublin at the time, wrote about it in the 1950s, a wonderful description. And he said that doctor, patient and the watching family alike viewed this feature with dread because there was very little chance of recovering from it. And it happened when the alveoli, the tiny sections of the lungs, filled with fluid and were unable to do their work oxygenating the blood. Next slide, please. The big question for now is, why did it end? Well, it was an influenza A H1N1 virus new to the human population. It spread over 2 or 3 years to most parts of the world. And by the end of that period, most people had been exposed to it. And if they were going to catch it really in vast numbers, they had caught it at that stage. It turned into, I suppose, really a seasonal flu after that. It continued to circulate until the 1958 pandemic, when it was replaced by the strain for that pandemic. And then somehow it got into circulation again in the 1970s until it was replaced by the 2009 influenza A H1N1 strain. Next slide, please. Global statistics for the flu. The initial most robust estimate was from an epidemiologist called Edward Oakes Jordan in the 1920s. He estimated about 20 million out of a global population of 2 billion caught it. Jürgen Muller and Niall Johnson did an estimate, I think back around 2010, which the WHO now uses, the World Health Organization, to say that perhaps 50 million died. But some estimates suggest that it was as high as 100 million. In some of the earlier estimates, like Jordan's, The Indian death estimate wasn't included at all, for example, and that's now variously given between 10 and 18 million, which is huge, almost as big as Jordan's original global estimate. The real figure will never be known. Death certification was in its infancy, really spurred on by the cholera pandemics of the 1800s, and in many countries it was still very patchy. Russia, of course, was in revolution, so we've no robust estimate for there. I've never seen a good estimate for South America or for China either. Certification was introduced, death certification by disease was introduced in Ireland since the 1860s and in many other countries already by then. And we and other countries who were cooperating used the ICD system of classification of death by disease, then the 1911 version. This is still in use in the most up-to-date version today. It's revised about every 10 years. And that means that people around the world, that the death is standardized by disease, so it's easier to compile comparative global statistics on it. Next slide, please. In Ireland, it's essentially been a hidden history until the 21st century. It's an extraordinary lacuna, really, given that Ireland, it was very much part of Ireland's war and Ireland's revolution story. Globally, the first person to do a really fascinating study on it was the American environmental historian Alfred Crosby, who wrote about its effects on America, but also on the war and particularly on the Paris Peace Conference. Here, it's only been written about since 2005 by Doctors Patricia Marsh and Katrina Foley and myself. And when we started doing work as postgraduate students. And we really had the extraordinary task for junior historians of shaping the narrative of this huge story, which was really obscured from the gaze of historians before that, even though it was very definitely remembered in the privacy of homes and in communities which had been badly affected by it. And people wonder a lot about this and why that happened. One economist suggested recently it was because it left no lasting societal trace. And really, I can't accept that at all, because there's too much evidence in the contemporary documents and also in oral histories that I've collected to say that it didn't leave a lasting societal trace. I think at the time, historians' focus was very much on covering war and on revolution. Social history really wasn't as fashionable as it is today. People weren't as interested in history below. That became increasingly popular, probably from the 1940s or so on, when you also see things like labour history, gender history, race history becoming much more popular, and of course oral history becoming much more popular. There's another reason, I think, and I think that's a really poignant one. And it's because disease was so much a part of normal human life, including here in Ireland at the time. Each year in Ireland at that stage, there were about 70,000 deaths on the whole island. It's a bit over 30,000 now. So we have just less than half, I think, of the number of deaths compared to then, because our living conditions and our ability to fight disease with medicine, vaccination, etc., and better living quality, housing quality has improved so much. But back then, 20% of the annual deaths each year were of children under the age of 5. And that's a statistic that always brings tears to my eyes. It shows really, I suppose, that death touched most families, and sometimes, some of them very often. So for them, this flu, when it happened, was just another noise in a loud cacophony of infectious disease. Some of the families I interviewed, they suffered death from several different diseases at the time. So perhaps you just move on to the next slide, please, Liam. Now it's become so well known that President Higgins held a commemoration for it in Ors an Uachtaráin on the 31st of May last year. And when we were holding this commemoration, Patricia Marsh, Guy Biner, myself and the President spoke at the time. We said that we wanted it also to be in part to remember the people who had lost people to it at the time, including President Higgins's own uncle, a 16-year-old boy in Fermoy at the time. And we also wanted to mark the contribution that medical workers and scientists would play in future pandemics, never thinking that it was just a few months away. Next slide, please. This is a very typical newspaper coverage from the time. It's the Sligo Champion from the 23rd of November 1918. I'll just read a few lines from it. This is almost again like an echo of what's happening today. The prevalence of the flu epidemic is casting the shadow of doom and depression all over the town of Sligo. We'd hoped that the disease in the mild form, this is at the second wave in November 1918, the first wave is much milder. We had known it at first would pass away without fatal consequences. The opposite has been the result. And this week's our sad duty to record a number of deaths as a result of this malady. In some cases, whole families were stricken down, and a feeling of nervousness and depression has spread all over. Nobody seems immune from attack. Next slide, please. And sorry, I've gone on two there. Just back one, yeah. The result is, as we've stated, a feeling of depression has settled down on the people. With the war ended and conscription had been averted, we have another enemy to face. And this death toll through the ravages of this enemy is, I think, not to be made light of all over Ireland. So that it shows how much they expected. And this is something people said to me in oral history interviews, that they really thought it was unfair that it should hit people when they'd suffered so much with the war. And in the revolutionary period, of course, we had more to come as well at that stage. Next slide, please. The statistics for Ireland show the official death toll is given by the Registrar General as 20,057, concentrated in 3 waves. I've added in about 3,000 excess pneumonia deaths on top of the annual pneumonia based on an average over the previous 10 years. So I'm suggesting that about between 800,000 and 900,000 catch flu, about 1/5 of the population, if the case fatality rate is 2.5%. So at least 0.5% of the population died. There's evidence to show that many deaths weren't certified as people were dying so fast. And we wonder, of course, couldn't COVID-19 have caused similar numbers of deaths if it hadn't been for lockdown? And could it be still if something really unfortunate was to happen again? Next slide, please. This is a map I did by county of the flu deaths in 1918. It really shows the first and second waves of the flu. So the first wave essentially covers the northeast quadrant down as far as Dublin. The second wave then, it moves, it again affects that same area in the north, but also moves down southwards really into Leinster. And at that stage, Kildare, Wicklow, Wexford, Carlow and Dublin are all badly affected. Next slide, please. In this one, it's 1919, the rates of death by county per thousand population in 1919. You can see it's roughly started to move across the Midlands and over to the west. Donegal gets a really bad attack in all 3 waves. And Patricia Marsh and I have looked at this quite a lot, and Patricia was saying probably seasonal labour. And then we thought, I heard, I interviewed somebody called Kathleen McMenamin, who was 100, I think she was 106 when I was in touch with her. And she told me that the British Navy were stationed in Lochswilly, and that as the ships would come in, the people would come in and out into the community off those boats, and that they were spreading flu, and that her mother was one of the nurses in the community who had been minding local people at the time. And she really thought it was this movement of troops that had spread around Donegal. County Mayo, we wonder whether it's seasonal labour that gives it a much worse experience in 1919. You'll see that County Clare had the lowest incidence of death from the flu in both years. And I like to make a sort of unfortunate joke that this is something to do with Percy French's song about the West Clare Railway, and how, not with Percy French's song, but with he pilloried the inefficiencies of the West Clare Railway, and that maybe it was because the railway wasn't working so well. But I think there are other reasons for that as well, which I'll touch on later. Next slide, please. These maps were done by TCD historians Frank Ludlow and Georgina Larragee for an exhibition in Glasnevin Cemetery on the 1918 flu last year. And they're done by Poor Law District Union, I think, and they also show a very similar picture of it. The first map is 1918 and the second is 1919, of it coming in through the East Coast and then essentially moving westwards as it spread around the country. Next slide, please. This slide shows Spanish flu and pneumonia deaths in Dublin in January 1918 to June 1919. And here you can see the three waves. The first one, a very small, that very small peak on the left, happens between the end of May and about mid-July 1918. The second wave then is the worst one in Dublin, and that happens from the beginning of October until really the end of the year in 1918. And the third wave then comes in early 1919, I think in the middle of February, and ends quite suddenly towards the end of April. And after that, there's no real spike in the deaths for the rest of 1919. The two lines there, the higher one, the blue one, is for flu deaths, and the other one, the green one, is for pneumonia deaths. And these statistics come from the Registrar General's weekly returns. Next slide, please. So as it passes through towns, suburbs and villages, I've surveyed most newspapers around the country now, reading them for the 2 years. So entire communities would go silent. Thousands would be ill, even in small towns like New Ross, Naas and Wexford at the time. One of the earliest outbreaks was in Howth, which at that stage had passenger ferries across to Britain. Other port towns like Kingstown or Dunleary, Dundalk, places like that were also affected early. So when it came through, schools and libraries would be formally closed in public buildings. Court sittings would be postponed. Matches, concerts are postponed or cancelled. And indeed, the All-Ireland senior hurling and football finals were played in January and February 1919 because of constant issues with illness and postponement. And even in the final, Wexford got their 4 in a row football final. I am from Wexford, because in part because the Tipperary team, their leading point scorer, was ill at the time. Shops and other businesses struggled to stay open. Their staffs went ill, but their footfall all went up very low. Some of the newspapers will say things like, people are sending out for their messages just now. Families would struggle to survive as it spread from member to member, and I have many, many accounts from the newspapers of entire families being found dead, or else, half the family would die, and the other family, when they were found, would be removed to the workhouse hospital or to other hospitals in the community, as they were too ill really to even get out of bed and go and call for help. And one story about this really sad one is the Phelan family in Corporation Street in Dublin. The husband, wife, and the husband's sister and an infant who were noticed not to have been around for some days. And then the neighbours and the janitor of the building break down the door, open the door to get in. They were really all gone beyond help, already dead or very near to death. And one interviewee in Naas told me of her, I think it was father, seeing coffin after coffin coming out the window of a house across the road from him at the time. In some areas like Naas, High and Dundalk and Clonmel, they set up communal kitchens to feed the ill. And farmers would donate food. What they called the good ladies of the town would come and cook it. And then other teams would come around and deliver it to houses where people were too ill to either cook or to get out of bed to come and collect it for themselves. Dundalk also set up a community nursing scheme to go, so they trained but again, what they call young girls to go and in rudimentary nursing skills so they could go out and at least care for their families at the time. Next slide, please. This slide shows the death rate from flu in Ireland in 1918 and 1919, classified by age group. And here on the left, you can see, sorry, the purple line is 1918 and the blue bar, the grey bar is 1919. You can see the under fives are particularly badly hit. And then you can see the unusual sector that's hit by this flu is young, strong adults. So you can see there rises for the from 20 up to probably about 40, 45 or so, but particularly those two groups, 20 to 25 and 25 to 35. So this is also a group that tends to be the parents of young children. So this is a double whammy impact on many families. Next slide, please. You can go again, I think that's it. This is a slide showing deaths from all causes in Dublin in the week ending the 2nd of November 1918. It's one of the peak weeks of the flu in Dublin. So even though it doesn't give flu specific details, you can see from the graphic, because it mirrors so closely that same age sector, the 25 to 35 year olds being badly hit and the under fives being badly hit, that a lot of these deaths will have been caused by flu. Next slide, please. So, who is most likely to die? Well, there are two factors there that really impact very much on your chances of dying from this flu. Children under 5 and adults 20 to 35, not necessarily the weak but strong adults. And a reason for this that has been given to me is because it might be something called a cytokine storm, an overactive response of the immune system. I'm not a scientist, so I'll leave you to go and look that up yourselves and see what it is. Not the elderly who were understood to have some immunity from a previous experience with a similar earlier disease. We don't know when. Death from the flu was much more likely in families where the breadwinner deals with the public because they'd be going out and bringing back the infection into their houses. And the Registrar General statistics show that this holds across class. At the time, the Registrar General divided Irish society into 4 different socio-economic classes. And even in the upper classes, which would include senior army officers, senior people in banks and things like that, the people, and also, of course, the large landowners and business people. But the people who dealt with the public, in the army and the banks, were more likely to die from it and to bring it home to their own families as well. So all types of shop workers, police, doctors, postal workers, were more likely to die. We've lost the... We'll get back to that now there in a second, Leah, once you can get it back in again. Down again, I think. Sorry about this. So if you go on, Liam, then to the slide with the graph in it. Oh yeah, sorry, no, that's okay, yeah. The other sector that was very likely to die from it, prison warders, priests, newspaper people, postal workers, army, labourers. And this was something I suppose I was warning from early on, that these sectors should be masked and should be taking extra precautions. Domestic service was quite protected from it, and I think that's because they didn't get out and about very much. And of course, the poor were very seriously impacted by it. This slide shows deaths in Dublin by social class and occupation, again from June 1918 to June 1919. And the first wave isn't all that clear there, but in the second and third waves, you can see them very clearly. The bottom pale blue thing is the upper class, and then the green one is the middle class. The orange one is artisans and petty shopkeepers, and the big one, the dark blue one, is the working class, which would include people like police and casual labourers, prison warders. Those sort of people would be in that sector. Frank Ludley showed me something very interesting when I showed him this graph, and that's that you can see in the first class, if you look in the middle, in the second wave, you can see there's something that he said is an inversion there. And he said that obviously the upper classes had copped on that something was happening, and that if they stayed at home, they didn't catch it. So there is this fall in deaths there. And again, this tallies with what appears in the newspapers. The Irish Times has a description from a shopkeeper in Westmoreland Street where he says that the better class of people are sending out for their messages just now. But they don't describe what happened to the poor people who actually were sent out for the messages. Next slide, please. So I think I've actually already talked about this one, so let's go on again. There was no grand plan from the Local Government Board for Ireland, which really essentially managed the health services at the time. The Poor Law Dispensary Service covered about 70% of the Irish population. That was under their control. The poor law doctors often worked around the clock, as eyewitnesses tell. Tommy Christian, that young witness, told me that the doctor came from the clinic in Kill in North Kildare to visit his family at 3 o'clock in the morning. And then he said, and then he got sick with the flu and we were jiggered all together, he said. Dr. Rafferty in Bray there's accounts in several different newspapers describing how he treated 300 patients in 74 households in a day in October 1918. And if you work that out and think that he spent 14 or 15 minutes in each household, he would have been working something like 18 hours without a break. So the service they gave was really incredible. Doctor after doctor fell ill, and then they would be replaced by locums, and then the locums would get ill and they'd have to be replaced also. And at the time, there was already a shortage of doctors because so many were away at the war. Hospitals were completely overwhelmed by the numbers. Small towns like Naas and New Ross had thousands ill in the flu in the first week of November 1918. So if you had 1,000 people under medical care in New Ross today from a flu or from COVID, how would they cope? D.W. McNamara writes of working on the matter and of most of the wards there being turned over to treat flu patients. They kept one male and one female ward for surgical patients. And this picture was replicated in hospitals and workhouses around the country. He spoke of how scary it was for doctors. And I think, again, we've heard that echoed now too. And of how in the matter, it was something of a comfort to have the constant plod past the window of horse-drawn hearses from the other hospitals in the city on their way to the cemetery in Glasnevin, as at least they were no different. There was no more dying there than there were in the matter. But most people were treated by home, as you can imagine today, if we had 800,000 ill as well. And good neighbours really nursed and saved many, many people. Next slide, please. The Irish, the Poor Law Medical Dispensary Service was run by the local government board, based at the Custom House. It was an aloof body, and it had been run by generations of civil servants, largely drawn from the establishment, often in disagreement with their local agents, the boards of guardians, who supervised the individual poor law unions at local level and directly employed the doctors in the poor law dispensary service. And you see in the newspapers constant rows between the boards of guardians and the local government board, who are constantly giving out saying that they've spent too much money, that they're not to pay more for doctor services, that they're not to pay for whiskey, and that they have to ration coal. And of course, coal is one of the few ways they have of keeping warmth in the hospitals and in the workhouses at the time. So the local government board, in common with the local government boards for England and Wales and Scotland, were not proactive, and they had no central plan. And that was partly because duties in relation to sanitation at the time were the responsibility of the local authorities under the various sanitary and disease legislation at the time. There's really strong criticism in the newspapers and even in the pro-government newspapers, like the Kildare Observer, who described them as being out of touch and not being in command of the situation. So it's another political tension. Next slide, please. At an emergency meeting of the Royal Academy of Medicine in Ireland on the 15th of November 1918, doctors got together to pool suggestions for different kinds of treatments. They effectively threw everything in their medical bag at it, but they couldn't find any one effective treatment. And again, this is so echoed today, and it's only now people are beginning to find treatments that work a lot better for COVID. So generally they said they gave something for sleeplessness. There are a lot of accounts of people not being able to sleep because the pain in their heads was so severe. And indeed, I've heard that in what's now St. James's and was then the Poor Law South Dublin Union Hospital, that the police were called in because the patients got so disturbed. They were trying to beat their heads off the walls and things like that to get rid of the pain. So the police were called in to subdue them. So the doctor said that for sleeplessness, they would give something like Trianol or some preparation of opium, a reminder of how medicine has changed. For headache, they'd give aspirin. Now, aspirin was made by Bayer, generally. And in America, rumor went round that Bayer, the German company, had actually infected the aspirin, the boxes of aspirin, with the flu virus, with the flu bug. For fever, they'd give quinine. And again, it's interesting that anti-malarial medicines have been used in the current pandemic as well. Doctors were very obsessed at the times with keeping bowels open. They thought that was key to a patient's health. So they gave calomel. And I think that's probably something of a confidence trick. Calomel was mercurous chloride, and I think the immediate reaction was the poor sick patient would get out of their bed and go to sit in the pot. And, maybe feel that the doctor had done something because they actually felt like getting out of bed. Alcohol was used, and often in copious quantities. D.W. McNamara described this happening with the older doctors in the matter. He said that they gave whiskey and brandy in abundance, and that it didn't do much to cure the flu, but at least it sent the patients on a merry dance to the hereafter because it would alleviate their symptoms. Sometimes in some places where alcohol wasn't approved of for religious reasons, the doctors would feel obliged to give an injection of strychnine as a stimulant. And I mean, my generation thinks of strychnine as being something used as a poison in a James Bond movie rather than being a medicine. Doctors agreed that vaccines made from several different kinds of bacteria weren't conclusive. There was no evidence to show that they were in any way helping. Vaccines were then generally given to people who actually already had the disease rather than as a prophylactic measure. There'd be a mixture of different kinds of bacteria understood to cause flu. So Sir Charles Cameron, the double medical officer of health at the time, he became something of a hero at the time, perhaps maybe like, our own chief medical officer, or like somebody like Luke O'Neill or Sam McConkey today. He was very calm and very sensible. He was 88 at the time of the flu. He'd been working diligently to improve the health of Dubliners for years, and it had come from a very low base to improve enormously. His advice was constantly sought by journalists, and it was very clear and easy to understand. And he just said that people should go to bed and stay there until well better and keep well nourished and well hydrated, and that many people had died from pneumonia following the flu, to stay in the bed for as long as you could. He said that people should stay at home to avoid contagion. His advice was very different to that which came from the LGB, who issued really complicated notices of advice, which would be very difficult to follow if you were in a panic and trying to figure out how to treat a sick relative from the flu. Next slide, please. So this is a cartoonist. W.K. Hazelden was a cartoonist for the Daily Mirror, and you'll find his cartoons on the wonderful British Cartoon Archive. They're free to view on there, and many other interesting Irish cartoons relevant to Ireland as well. Hazelden's father had once had a very serious influenza illness, so he was really interested in the disease. This and many of his other flu cartoons from the time show the kind of paranoia that was experienced by people about the flu at the time, and about the fears of everybody had about it. So it shows here that at 8 a.m. somebody would get out of bed, that gargle with a common household remedy, Condy's fluid. At 8:10 they'd take a little dose of cinnamon. At 9 o'clock, dressed for work, they would take a spot of quinine. At 9:30 they would inhale eucalyptus, which is also seen as a flu preventive. 10 o'clock they'd douse themselves in any strong disinfectant, and by 10:30 they'd dress themselves in a big box and head out to go to work. So again, it's some of the, it's a strong reminder of the way we don't leave our houses now without washing our hands, or come back into them without washing our hands, and we have the disinfectant bottle handy. Again, next slide, please. In the long term, what did it change? It had a strong influence on the development of socialized medicine. It's probably part of the reason why the NHS happened in the UK. One of the factors that contributed to the idea that universal healthcare was a good idea for society in general. It was also very influential on the growth of socialized medicine in Canada and in other parts of the world as well. It introduced much more international cooperation through what's known as the OIHP at that time, a precursor of the WHO, based in Paris, the OIHP, the Office International d'Hygiène Publique, forgive my pronunciation, but that coordinated international cooperation on infectious disease at the time, and really brought in the monitoring that we have through the WHO today. In terms of domestic outcomes in Ireland, the Irish Public Health Council report of 1920 doesn't specifically mention it. And yet, because of the measures it suggests changing in the Irish health system, because of the flu, the stress the flu had placed on it, it's really quite clear that it is being taken into account and is informing many of the changes they suggested. But it didn't happen. These changes didn't happen immediately. They happened over several years because of the changing political situation as we moved very quickly towards independence. Next slide, please. Flu is adapted by Sinn Féin as propaganda. Many nationalists had been rounded up and interned under the German plot, kind of a trumped-up charge that was invented by the government because of the mass meetings and the political activity during the anti-conscription campaigns of 1918. So Sinn Féin, their propagandists give really dire warnings that if the flu comes and any of these people are damaged, there will be an accounting to be made. And then flu really plays right into the hands of the propagandists. Richard Coleman, who had been out in 1916, in the 1916 rebellion in Ashburn, he's from Swords, he's interned in Usk, and he died days before the December 1918 election. And his death was swiftly incorporated into the posters around the city in Dublin. They were covered in black crepe with crosses on them to mark his death. And Sinn Féin described his death as murder. And, clearly it will have helped, had some kind of an impact on the influenza pandemic. And indeed my colleague in Carlow College, Elaine Callanan, is publishing her book on the political situation at the time and discusses this. Another Sinn Féin internee, Pierce McCann, died on the 6th of March 1919 in England. He'd actually just been released, but news hadn't reached the newspapers about this yet. He died in a nursing home. But again, it's used very much in the newspapers to ram home the message that Ireland has been treated unfairly, Irish politicians in particular. He has been elected an MP in the December 1918 election, that they've been treated really unfairly by the government. There's also some evidence to show that people don't go out to vote in December for fear of catching the flu, and the flu also would have been spread during the celebrations for the end of the war in November 1918. One of the reasons why I thought it was quite important that we didn't have St. Patrick's Day, there was statistical evidence to show that mass meetings could spread a disease like that, so that we wouldn't have the normal celebrations for St. Patrick's Day. Next slide, please. This is just some the coverage from the Irish Independent around the time of Coleman's death. And the thing on the left-hand side was an ad on the front page of the Irish Independent on, I think, the 11th of December 1918. And Coleman is now added to the list of Irish martyrs, which include people like Emmett and Pierce Conley and Ash. Next slide, please. And then this is Pierce McCann, who died from flu. He's MP for Tipperary East at that stage. So he dies on the 6th of March, 1919. Next slide, please. Kathleen Lynn dodged being arrested during the German plot roundup, but she remained on the run. So the Lord Mayor O'Neill, Dublin's Lord Mayor, arranged for herself to give herself up, come off the run on the condition, released her on the condition that she would treat the influenza ill, which she was already doing in a temporary nursing home at Charlemont Street, where she treated many people. It's quite a small operation, but it does treat an awful lot of people there. And she also vaccinated thousands with an influenza vaccination in Dublin. The vaccination is believed to have saved many people. What it may have done, when I asked scientists what such a vaccination made of bacteria would do, they say that it might prevent them getting pneumonias, meningitis, or other secondary infections. I don't know what was in her vaccine, but I do know what was in others, so that they were generally made from different strains of bacteria. Next slide, please. When I began researching this for my PhD in 2006, my supervisor in Trinity College Dublin, Professor David Dixon, he was probably getting a little bit tired listening to all the statistics and thought this needs to get to be about people. And I think that's something that very much has happened now too. In the beginning, we were focusing on the numbers rather than focusing on the fact that behind each one of those death statistics, there is a sad family, a grieving family, and altered lives, as well as a lost life. I've done about 50 interviews or repeat interviews with people who lived through the pandemic as small children. They were generally aged, the age range was, at the time of the flu, they would have been aged between 3 and I think 15, Kathleen McMenamin being that oldest one. And when I interviewed them, they ranged in age between 95 and 106, again, Kathleen McMenamin being the oldest one there. I've also interviewed a lot of families who suffered loss, and they were able to describe the impact that this made on their families, often over generations. And I expected when I started interviewing to be finding things like the details of when did the doctor come. And sure, people like Tommy Christian told me that, or what they were treated with. And sure, again, Tommy Christian told me that they were treated with linseed and poultices, which was put on the chest. And he said it gave him a lot of relief. And he described also being given as a 5-year-old or 6-year-old when he had it first, when he had it, being given a hot whiskey. Not something I think we'd give to children today, but if it was the only treatment, we probably would. But he also told me about longer term impacts. And, his mother had another illness, but he thinks it curtailed her life, that her death was brought forwards. And that she died about a year afterwards, having really lost her health further through the flu. And this is quite a common finding. You'll find that things like TB, the statistics drop the following year because they're reaped early, that they've died sooner than they would have otherwise. And again, I think that's something that we've seen now too. So the impact on families was not only the immediate crisis, but also the long-term economic and emotional trauma. Because often if the breadwinner died, if you think about those people 25 to 35, if they were the breadwinner in a family, you'd lose the family income. But you'd also quite likely, back in those days, the family home might go with the job as well. If you were a school teacher or a prison warder, often your home would come with the job too. So the family would lose both. So really the most important role the pandemic played was in the lives of the individual people and the families who suffer that loss of permanent disability, perhaps lifelong damage from disease of loved ones. And we don't know how many of the children became orphaned, but many, many were. And for some, life was never the same again. They suffered damaged health, trauma or loss. And again, people who've lost people today and are suffering today will carry similar trauma. It doesn't go away when the immediate crisis passes. And I think this is something we're learning more and more now. Next slide, please. So for the rest of this talk, I just want to talk really about a few of the people. Liam, how are we for time? A few of the people that I have interviewed.
No, we're fine for time.
Okay.
Yeah. No problem.
So the first one who's here in my slides is Stella Larkin Mccallum, who is James Larkin's granddaughter, and very generously gave me really several interviews and her thoughts on this. And she told me about her mother's family, the Moores. Her mother was Anna Moore, who lived in a tenement, a one-room tenement at 34 Marlborough Street in Dublin, right near the Spire. She was the third of 10 children. She was born in 1909. She was the only one of those 10 children to survive beyond the age of 5. Isn't that something that's so sad? Civil registration on the Glasnevin cemetery records enabled me to find that 4 of the Moore children died from infectious disease between 1911 and 1918. Infant diarrhea, measles, and in November 1918, 4-year-old little Mary Moore. She was actually 4 3/4, almost that magic age 5 when children seem to get more protected. She died from flu at the height of the second wave. Stella told me that this little girl was believed to have the gift of sight, and that she said to her mother, "Mummy, could you please dress me in my best dress? I feel something important is going to happen." And she climbed into the one bed in the family home and died from the flu. So that was really at the height of the second wave in Dublin. Stella's very thoughtful testimony made me much more aware of the syndemic disease environment in Ireland at the time of the pandemic and how it impacted very directly on families. Next slide, please. So the next slide is little Mary Moore's death listed in the Registrar General's findings, and you can see there that it actually lists her as bronchitis. She's child of a labourer, so again a sector that's particularly vulnerable at the time in that 4th class. He might have been a casual labourer who mightn't have had consistent work or anything like that, and that would impact also on the kind of stocks and supplies family would have at a time of pandemic. You need savings to get through it. And of course, now we have the COVID payment, which has helped so many families, but that didn't exist in 1918, 1919. If you didn't have savings with the family, you were relying on charity or family handouts to help you out, or on, those soup kitchens that I described earlier. Next slide, please. The next slide is actually a list of the other entries from the same page of the death statistics, death certification as hers. And if you start at the top, you see bronchopneumonia, 6 years, child of a clerk, Then the next one is a 3-year-old boy, child of a soldier from bronchopneumonia. Then the 31-year-old wife of a pork butcher from flu. A 15-year-old daughter of a labourer who died from influenza, a 4-year-old child of a labourer who died from bronchitis, and then a 7-month-old child of a fitter who died from flu. So these are the same. When you see flu impacting on an area and you find the dates where it happened, you see these kind of lists repeated. They're so sad. In all the towns and all the places around the country where they happened at the time. And Glasnevin and the cemetery records, other cemetery records, have similar records as well. They're just incredibly sad to look at. Thank you. Next slide, please. This story is, this lady here is Nellie Tubridy, who was born Nellie Marinan. She was born on the 28th of October in Sligo. Her family were actually from West Clare, from the village of Courclair and thereabouts. Her father was a constable in the RIC, which is why they were stationed in Sligo. Her mother gave birth to her when she was suffering from influenza and then died. And Nellie was born prematurely. She was only about 2 pounds weight. So you can imagine how difficult it was in 1918 to look after a tiny baby. And of course, one of the big issues with tiny babies, I had one myself, a 2-pound baby, is keeping them warm, because they've no fat and very little body mass to keep warm. So it's very easy for them to get too chilled. So when her mother died, Nellie was brought down in a shoebox lined with cotton wool from Sligo down to Ennis, I think by train, and then was brought the rest of the way on foot, because the roads at the time in Clare were cut up, which of course is another reason why Clare experienced a lower incidence of flu, because of the military situation at the time. The roads were cut up. So her I think it was her uncle by marriage, walked all the way from Courclair into Ennis. And along the way, he arranged for various households at certain stages to light up fires so that she could recover her body heat as he brought her back home to her new home in Courclair with himself and his wife. And he collected her, brought her home and did this. And I think for several weeks afterwards, either he or his wife, Ellen, kept Nellie's little baby body strapped to their chests, and one of them would lie beside her at the fire at the side of their house, constantly burning fire to keep her warm until she was old enough to maintain her own body heat. She lived into her 80s. Some of you may know her from the West Clare village of Courclair. She was a very bright and engaging woman, and often told the story of her early start, no bigger than a bag of sugar. Next slide, please. That's actually her mother's death certificate there. This gentleman here is Tommy Christian. He was my favourite interviewee because he just gave such a rich interview. I love them all. They all were so generous to give me their thoughts and ideas, and every one of them gave me something useful. He was born on the 21st of December 1913. He caught the flu at the age of, I think, 6 rather than 5 in January 1919. His ability to recall things that happened to him as a child was really exceptionally accurate. For example, he told me 2 people had died in the neighbouring town in Kill, and exactly when we checked the records, we found that he was exactly right about that. Some of the information he gave me provided insights, that thing about the doctor coming at 3 o'clock in the morning, that were available from no other source. Thanks. Next slide, please. This beautiful lady here in this image here is Minnie Crothers with her 4 children. This story was shared with me by Claire Ablett from the Ulster Museum. Minnie died at her home at the Crumlin Road in Belfast on the 18th of November 1918. And when she died, her husband Thomas took their 4 children to start a new life in Canada. When they got there, he couldn't get work, and the children were taken into care for a time until he got a job as a postman, and they got back together then, which was great. So, but for a while, the children had lost their mother, they'd lost their home, they'd lost the wider family circle, and their father also. And of course, this had a long impact on the family. And all her youngest daughter, Dorcas, who was Claire's grandmother, could remember about her mother was the black plumed horses pulling the hearse at our funeral in Belfast. Dorcas is that beautiful little girl sitting on her knee there. Next slide, please. Yeah, I think you can go again because I probably have the... yeah, and again, this is Catherine Moore in Heatley. Catherine's husband, Charles, they lived in Dublin, very near the civic offices. He died at the Battle of the Somme, leaving her to raise 3 young sons. She dies from influenza pneumonia in November 1918 with the sons at their bedside. They never knew what she died from until her grandson, Fred Heatley, found out. We looked up the death certificate and he found her grave at Glasnevin Cemetery. And now I think it's really nice that her grave, because of Fred's research, her grave is on the Glasnevin tours, and that she at last is recognised. Next slide, please. This picture is of James Delaney and his wife Margaret. He's a very typical victim. He's a young adult, aged 25 to 35, working with the public. He was a Dublin Metropolitan Police Constable stationed at Lad Lane at the time. He caught flu in December 1918 and stayed home for a while, but then felt probably obliged to go back to work. Like that warning that Charles Cameron gave, he went back to work too soon and he died on the job. He died from influenza pneumonia in January 1919. So this really forces a major change for their family. His wife, Margaret, had to go out and become the income earner. She set herself up as a cake maker. And for a while again, their children, they had 2 children at the time, Dennis and Rebecca, infants. And they're sent away to be minded by family while she's setting herself up in business, but they get back together again and had, next slide, please, then. So this is Margaret with the 2 children. Beck, the little girl you see there in the picture, she died from scarlet fever a couple of years later. And that meant that Dennis, who was my friend Anne Burke's grandfather, she told me this story, that he was really wrapped up in cotton wool by his family and not allowed to do very much. He wasn't allowed to play games. About the biggest risk they would let him take was he was allowed to play cricket. So, he was, I suppose, quite traumatized by his father's death, as you could imagine. Any child of that age, happening with that kind of loss. And the family were very protective of him because so much had happened to the family from infectious disease. Next slide, please. This brings it very close to home for me. James and Elizabeth Millon, they were actually both cousins of my grandfathers. We were married to each other. James was 59. He died from flu in December 1918. He wasn't a well man, judging by his death certificate anyway. I think it said a weak heart on the death certificate. And then his wife, Elizabeth, who was a few years younger than him, she died very soon after him. Their deaths meant that their 2 children, who were in their early teens at the time, lost their home as well as their parents. It was a tenant farm. They didn't hold on to the farm. One child went to Dublin to be relations, and the other child was minded by my 2 spinster grandaunts in Enniscorthy for a while as well. So the deaths meant that they lost each other as well as their parents and their home. So again, another very sad impact. And the next slide, please. I'm nearly coming to an end now. This image here is of Bab, or Eileen Davitt, in North Wexford, a great friend of our family. I'm from near Strahert, Tonbrack, that direction, if any of you know it. And Bab told me of her mother and her aunt wanting to nurse the neighbours in Strahert in a house that was only really 100 yards away from them, the Lancasters. But they were so afraid that doing so would bring the flu back to their own house that they walked 4 miles in to ask the parish priest in Ferns whether this would bring disaster to their own family. And the local priest assured them that it wouldn't. So they came back, and the nursed in Lancasters, I think 2 of the Lancasters died, but they were able to save the rest of them. And indeed, they said that God kept his word, that they never managed to catch the flu. Next slide, please. So on the left, you see in a cluster of trees there is actually the house where my mother lives today, but that was, it's the same site where their parents' house, where Bab's family lived at the time. And on the right, you see a grey building that's now a shed, but was then the home of the Lancaster family. And so that's the distance they walked to go and nurse the family. And instead, they walked 4 miles in the opposite direction to this road, which looks straight down at Mount Leinster, to go into Ferns before they'd go to that house, just to make sure that God would be on their side and that he would protect them for this act of good neighbourliness. And I suppose when I was growing up as a child in the 1960s, I was in that house quite often, and I sat on the knee of Dennis, who I thought of then as old Dennis Lancaster, and he's probably younger than I am now. I sat, well, perhaps not, but close to it. And I sat on his knee and listened to him telling me stories, never realizing that one day I would be researching a story that affected his family so very tragically. And I suppose it's a real lesson to all of us that in 1918, 1919, all of our families were that close to somebody who died in that flu. So thank you very much, and I'll leave it there, and glad to take any questions you have.
Thanks a million, Ida. That was fantastic. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can hear you fine.
Brilliant. Thanks for, we've got an amazing amount of questions here, and to be honest, you've answered most of them in your lecture itself. I just have a couple of ones that I'll just run past you. There is one question here in terms of what would the current government learn from mistakes of the past, if you like, in terms of lockdown, etc.
Well, I suppose as this was happening, I was very much trying to come out of my historian hiding behind a wall sort of retreat in the archives thing, and write a lot about what the lessons were as we were moving along. And I don't think the government actually needed all that much help. But one of the things I was trying to very much show from the beginning was that clear communication is essential, because people in a panic can't cope with really complicated communication. So that you have to make the advice simple and easy to follow. Another one that I wrote in the Irish Times was about, that governments had to do something to build confidence. And that they had to take measures. So things like, the Wuhan, the authorities building that hospital in 5 days, that's a way of building confidence. And here we had that wonderful daily press conference where, the cooperation between journalism and NEFIT and the government was, for all people might criticise one aspect or another, overall it's been quite outstanding. And I suppose one of the lessons to learn from that is that we need to get good quality information very quickly into newspapers and to the public as quickly as we can. And also, trust is so important because people will comply if with stringent, and we've done amazingly as a country, because we have that, essentially do have that trust with the government, even though there will be dissenting voices, but essentially we do have it.
And what are your thoughts at the moment on? It was a very significant impact in terms of the 1918, but the second wave was massive.
Yeah.
In terms of the impact it had. what are your thoughts on where we are currently and the potentials for second wave?
Well, I suppose one of the fears now is we have been so locked down that will we start to be too careless? But I think, I suppose the issue will be, and I understand this from a group of doctors that I've been lucky to, a doctors group called the COVID Influencers Group, set up by Professor Oisin O'Connell, really to get that information very quickly into the public domain between doctors and newspapers. Is that the one thing they would emphasize is the importance of contact tracing, and that new app will help so much. If you haven't signed it up, please do. That it will become very important in the coming weeks, that if there are small outbreaks, to be able to identify them very quickly and to take the people who might be infected out of circulation. Otherwise, we could face something like happened in 1918 with the bigger second wave, or at least a strong second wave.
Well, hopefully that won't happen.
Yeah.
But thanks so much, Ida. That was a fantastic lecture. We all enjoyed it. I think that was our second biggest lecture of the year. We had something like 180 people joining in there. So thank you so much. Really appreciate it. No, it was a great lecture, very topical, history focused, but very relevant as well in current times. Next week's lecture is on the life and times of Jonathan Swift by Dr. Brendan Toomey. So we hope you'll all join in for that as well. So thanks a million again, Ida. Great job. I've got 63 comments in the chat box. I'm sure they're all very complimentary. I'm not going to get to them all, but I'll send them all on to you later. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Thanks everybody for listening in, and stay safe.
Go on.